The old man was just in seat 16A, until his call sign made the F-35 pilots salute midair. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into the story. A quiet hush settled over the cabin of the airplane as the elderly man, sitting in seat 16A, stared out of the window. His frail, weathered hands rested gently on the armrests, his eyes distant as he observed the endless expanse of clouds below. It was clear that he wasn't just an ordinary passenger, but a man of experience, though he never made a fuss about it. His appearance didn't stand out, just a simple navy blue jacket, an old, worn cap, and a quiet demeanor that seemed to keep to himself. The younger passengers around him were chatting and laughing, their voices carrying in the air as the plane made its way through the sky. Yet, they couldn't help but glance his way, some with curiosity, others with mild amusement. One young man, sitting a few rows ahead, turned around and eyed the older man, raising an eyebrow. "Hey, old man," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You still serving?" The elderly man didn't immediately respond. He simply gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, the kind that said he'd heard it all before. The young man wasn't done, though. "What's your rank, Grandpa?" he continued, not noticing the other passengers' growing discomfort. "You're not a general, are you? Or just a washed-up vet looking for attention?" A few others snickered at his remark, but the elderly man remained calm. He didn't engage. He didn't need to. The young man leaned back in his seat, seemingly satisfied with his own bravado. A few minutes later, he turned back toward the elderly man. "Well, I bet you don't even have a call sign, do you? You probably don't even know what that is." The comment was met with a few chuckles from nearby passengers, the atmosphere light but tinged with the typical impatience of youth. The elderly man's response, however, was unexpected. In a soft, steady voice, he replied, "I used to fly under the call sign Maverick." There was a moment of silence, as the passengers processed the name. The young man scoffed, thinking it was just another old man claiming glory. But then, something odd happened. The plane's intercom crackled to life, the voice of the captain filling the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing some turbulence as we approach our destination. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened." But just before the captain finished his announcement, a new voice came over the radio. "Maverick, this is Echo 1. We have you in visual range. Preparing for the salute." The atmosphere in the cabin shifted instantly. The young man who had mocked the elderly man turned pale. His friends, who had been snickering, now fell silent. The elderly man looked at the window again, a brief flicker of recognition in his eyes. It wasn't long before the plane's cockpit doors opened, and two F-35 fighter jets were seen in formation beside the commercial airliner. The young man's jaw dropped as the F-35 pilots, through their communications system, announced, "Maverick, it is an honor to have you on board." The elderly man slowly stood up, a dignified smile crossing his face. The F-35 pilots, recognizing the legendary call sign, executed a flawless mid-air salute, their jets soaring in perfect synchronization. The cabin, now completely silent, watched in awe as the elderly man turned toward the young man who had once mocked him. With a calm, almost fatherly gaze, the old man spoke again, "Respect, young one. It's not always about what you see on the outside. It's about what you've done and who you've become." The young man, speechless, looked around the cabin at the other passengers, their faces a mixture of shock and newfound respect. The elderly man returned to his seat, the salute still echoing in the minds of those who witnessed it. His legend, once mocked, was now undeniable. The atmosphere inside the airplane had shifted from light-hearted banter to stunned silence, as the elderly man, now recognized as Maverick, sat back down in seat 16A. The young man who had mocked him was still frozen in shock, staring out of the window, unable to process what had just unfolded. The F-35 pilots, after their flawless mid-air salute, began to slowly peel away from the commercial airliner, their engines roaring as they completed the perfect formation maneuver. The passengers, who had once snickered and dismissed the old man, were now leaning forward in their seats, their eyes wide with disbelief. The cabin was still, save for the soft hum of the plane's engines and the distant sound of the fighter jets cutting through the sky. Maverick, his calm demeanor unwavering, adjusted his cap and continued gazing out the window. The young man, who had been so brash just moments before, now turned to his friends with an expression of confusion and awe. His bravado had vanished, replaced by the weight of the realization that he had just insulted someone far more important than he could have ever imagined. He hesitated, glancing toward the elderly man, whose quiet presence seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 untold stories. Then, almost as if on cue, a soft voice from behind interrupted the stillness. "Excuse me, sir, but I need to speak with you for a moment," said a young man, wearing the uniform of an Air Force officer. He was standing in the aisle, holding a notepad in his hands. Maverick turned slightly in his seat, raising an eyebrow but offering no immediate response. The young officer, clearly nervous, continued, "I know who you are, sir. I'm Lieutenant Ryan Jacobs. I've read about your missions. I'm in awe of you." Maverick's gaze softened as he looked at the young officer, who seemed to be trying to find the right words. "I never thought I would meet someone like you in person," Lieutenant Jacobs said, his voice shaking slightly. The elderly man leaned forward, folding his hands in his lap, his expression gentle but serious. "You've read about me?" Maverick asked. The lieutenant nodded, his eyes filled with admiration. "Yes, sir. The things you've done, saving lives, being a part of some of the most important missions in military history. I've always respected the legends. But to meet you, to see you here, like this," he trailed off, struggling to find the right words. Maverick smiled faintly. "I'm just an old man now, Lieutenant. The legends aren't important. It's the people we help along the way that matter." Lieutenant Jacobs stood there, his jaw clenched as he processed Maverick's words. "But still, sir," he began, "your call's sign, the respect you've earned. I've never seen anything like that." Maverick didn't respond immediately. He just nodded, his eyes distant as he remembered the years he had spent in the sky, on missions that were often too classified to speak about. He had flown countless operations, saved countless lives, and made decisions that changed the course of history. But none of that mattered now. He was here, in seat 16A, just like any other passenger. But that was the power of his call sign. It wasn't just a name. It was a symbol of who he had been and what he had done. The legend didn't need to be flaunted. It spoke for itself. Lieutenant Jacobs, clearly struggling with the weight of the moment, took a deep breath. I never imagined this," he muttered, more to himself than to Maverick. "I've always heard the stories, but to meet you, to realize you're just sitting here." The young officer paused, his eyes wide. Maverick turned to face him fully, his voice low and calm. "Don't worry about it, Lieutenant. Legends are made by those who come after. You've got your own story to write." The lieutenant nodded slowly, his respect for the elderly man deepening. As he turned to leave, he hesitated, looking back at Maverick. "Thank you, sir," he said quietly, "for everything." Maverick didn't say another word. He simply nodded, his gaze returning to the clouds outside. The plane continued its steady course, the silence in the cabin growing more profound as the realization settled over everyone that they were in the presence of greatness. The young man who had mocked Maverick earlier, now in a state of stunned reverence, sat in his seat, his mind racing. He had no idea that the quiet old man sitting next to him was a living legend, a man who had seen and done things that would forever change the way he viewed the world. As the plane made its descent toward the airport, the passengers who had once dismissed Maverick were now silently acknowledging him, a deep respect filling the air. They had all witnessed something extraordinary, and each of them would carry the memory of the F-35 pilots saluting the old man in seat 16A for the rest of their lives. The plane began its descent, the hum of the engines steady and soothing as it cut through the skies toward the airport. Maverick, still sitting in seat 16A, didn't look out the window this time. His hands were resting calmly on his lap, his gaze lost in thought, but his mind was far from the present. The young man, who had mocked him earlier, was now silent, his head slightly turned toward Maverick. He had not said a word since the F-35s had performed their salute, and he had barely acknowledged the elderly man. The crew members, who had once glanced over with casual indifference, now seemed to look at him with a quiet reverence. It was clear that the old man sitting in the seat wasn't just a veteran. He was something far more significant. The young man, still trying to piece together what had just happened, leaned toward Maverick. I never knew, he began, his voice hesitant. I never imagined. All of that. The way they spoke to you, the way they saluted you. You were like a hero. Maverick turned slowly, his pale blue eyes meeting the young man's gaze. He said nothing for a moment, simply studying him. Then, in his usual quiet, measured tone, he spoke. Heroes come in many forms, son. Some of them wear uniforms. Others, like me, are just lucky enough to survive. The young man blinked, taken aback by the response. He had expected some grand declaration, some heroic speech about battles fought and won, but instead, Maverick's words were calm, almost somber. But you are a hero, right? The young man asked, unsure if he should have pressed further. Maverick smiled faintly. I don't need to be remembered, son. The ones who were there with me, they're the real heroes. I was just doing my job. The young man's mind was racing. The words didn't match the gravity of the moment, and he couldn't reconcile the humble demeanor of the old man with the obvious respect he commanded. It was clear now, Maverick wasn't just an old war veteran. He was someone who had lived through hell and come out on the other side, a survivor of battles most people couldn't even begin to comprehend. The flight attendants, who had been bustling around earlier, now moved with quiet steps, casting furtive glances toward Maverick as they passed. A few murmured quietly to each other, though none dared to interrupt. As the plane touched down and taxied toward the gate, the young man turned to Maverick once more. I never meant to disrespect you, he said quietly, the earlier mockery gone from his voice. I was just joking around. I had no idea. Maverick nodded, his face unreadable. You didn't know? That's all. The plane rolled to a stop at the gate, the captain's voice coming over the intercom to announce their arrival. Ladies and gentlemen, we've arrived at our destination. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until the seatbelt sign has been turned off. The passengers around them began to gather their belongings, but the young man stayed in his seat, his eyes still locked on Maverick. So, he began again, this time with a genuine curiosity in his voice. What was it like? The missions, the flying, the danger, all of it. Maverick looked out the window, as if searching for an answer in the view outside. It's hard to explain, he said after a moment. You live through things you never thought you would, things that no one else will ever understand. And when it's over, you move on. You have to. The young man absorbed the words, feeling the weight of them. He had always thought of war as something distant, something that belonged to the past, something he could never truly understand. But now, sitting next to this man, it felt real. It felt close. And as the plane's doors opened and the passengers began to file out, the young man stood hesitantly, his hand gripping the back of his seat. He turned back to Maverick. Thank you for everything. I think I'll never forget this. Maverick didn't say anything in response. He simply stood up, straightened his jacket, and began to make his way toward the exit. The young man watched him go, a deep respect growing within him, a respect that would remain with him long after the flight had ended. As he exited the plane, he glanced one last time at Maverick, who had now disappeared into the crowd. The old man, who had once been mocked, was now a figure of reverence. He would carry that memory with him always. The F-35 pilots, the salute, the call sign, all of it had shown him the truth. Some heroes didn't need recognition. They had already earned it in the way. They lived their lives. The young man walked off the plane, his feet dragging slightly as he tried to absorb everything that had just happened. Maverick's presence had left a mark on him, something deeper than just a momentary encounter. The gravity of the F-35 salute, the respect the pilots had shown, and the calm way Maverick had carried himself through it all, it was overwhelming. It wasn't every day you met a legend, and the young man knew he would never look at the world the same way again. As he stepped out of the terminal, he spotted Maverick ahead, walking slowly with his suitcase in hand. Maverick wasn't drawing attention. He wasn't boasting or looking for anyone to recognize him. He simply walked, as though the journey was just another part of the path he'd always been on. The young man quickened his pace, unsure of what he was feeling. Was it admiration? Or was it something more profound, Something that came from the quiet understanding that, in the presence of true greatness, the world seemed to pause, just for a moment. Sir, he began, his voice hesitant as he caught up with Maverick. The older man turned, his expression calm and unreadable. Yes, Lieutenant? Maverick asked, his voice soft but steady. The young man paused, gathering his thoughts. I don't think I fully understood what you went through, until today. The way you handled everything. It was incredible. I don't know what to say. Maverick gave a small, knowing smile. You don't have to say anything. Sometimes, the most important moments are the ones we don't speak about. The young man nodded, but he wasn't sure if he fully understood. What was it about Maverick that made him seem so unshakable? It wasn't just his calm demeanor. There was something deeper, something that spoke to the core of who he was. A man who had faced challenges that most people couldn't even fathom and had come out stronger for it. What's it like? The young man asked after a moment. Being part of something so much bigger than yourself. Maverick's eyes flickered with something. Maybe recognition, maybe a memory, and he sighed. It's not easy. You live with the weight of every decision you make, and the people you've lost along the way. But you also live with the knowledge that, at least for a while, you made a difference. And that makes all the difference. The young man felt a lump form in his throat. He wasn't sure if it was sadness or gratitude, but he could feel it in his chest, deep and heavy. I'll never forget this, he said softly. Maverick nodded. You won't have to. But remember, son, it's not about remembering me. It's about remembering those who didn't make it. The ones who never had the chance to return. They walked in silence for a few moments, each lost in their own thoughts. The young man couldn't help but wonder how many times Maverick had walked this path, how many people had crossed his path, never realizing who he really was. But there was something more, something that had begun to take root in his heart. The realization that being a hero wasn't about recognition. It wasn't about medals or accolades. It was about the lives you touched, the respect you earned, and the quiet legacy you left behind. Maverick stopped walking and turned to the young man. You'll do fine, Lieutenant. Just remember this. Honor isn't something you earn with words. It's earned through your actions. Never forget that. The young man stared at Maverick, a sense of clarity washing over him. He had always thought that respect and honor were things that came with age, with time, with experience. But now, standing before this old man, he realized that respect and honor were things you earned every day, through the choices you made and the way you lived your life. Thank you, sir, the young man said, his voice steady now, his respect for Maverick growing deeper with every word. Maverick didn't respond. He simply turned and walked toward the exit of the airport, leaving the young man standing there, feeling as though he had just been given the greatest lesson of his life. As the door slid open, the young man watched Maverick disappear into the crowd, but this time, he didn't feel the same sense of awe. This time, it was something stronger, something that could only come from witnessing greatness up close. Maverick's presence had done more than teach him about respect. It had shown him what it meant to be truly honorable. And as the young man walked toward his own future, he knew that Maverick's words would stay with him forever. They would guide him, shape him, and remind him every day that honor wasn't given, it was earned. The day had faded into evening by the time Maverick made his way through the crowded streets of the city. The young lieutenant, still lost in thought, walked quietly by his side, the weight of their conversation lingering in the air. As they approached the old, familiar diner, Maverick paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the street, as if searching for something from the past. You're wondering why I came here, aren't you? Maverick asked, turning to the lieutenant. The young man nodded slowly, his curiosity piqued. I guess so, he replied. Maverick smiled faintly, the edges of his eyes crinkling. This was my place. I used to come here after long missions, to unwind. Sometimes, all you need is a cup of coffee and a place where nobody knows your name. They stepped inside the diner, the bell above the door chiming as they entered. The smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, instantly bringing Maverick back to a simpler time, when life wasn't so complicated. As they walked to a booth in the back, Maverick's eyes caught the attention of the waitress, a woman with silver hair and a warm smile. Good to see you, Tom, she said, using the name Maverick had gone by when he was a regular. What can I get for you? Maverick paused for a moment, his fingers tapping the edge of the table. Just a coffee, thanks. Black, he replied, his voice steady. The young lieutenant sat across from him, still processing the day's events. I never expected to see you in a place like this, he said, looking around at the simple, unassuming diner. Maverick chuckled softly, his gaze focused on the menu in front of him. There's a lot you don't expect in life, he said quietly. You think you've seen it all, that you know how everything works. But the truth is, there's always something waiting to surprise you. The waitress returned with the coffee, placing a steaming mug in front of Maverick. You sure you're not going to tell me some more story about your past? She asked, a playful glint in her eye. Maverick's smile faded, but his eyes softened. I've told those stories 1,000 times, Linda, he said, his voice laced with quiet nostalgia. It gets old after a while. Sometimes, I just want to be here, in a place where I'm not the hero. Just another guy, having a cup of coffee. The lieutenant watched him closely, his mind racing with questions. Do you ever regret it? He asked, breaking the silence. Maverick looked at him, his eyes thoughtful. Regret what? The lieutenant hesitated, unsure how to phrase his question. The things you've done, the people you've lost. Does it ever get to you? Maverick took a slow sip of his coffee, the warmth of the mug in his hands grounding him. Every day, he said quietly. You can't live through the things I have and not carry a little bit of it with you. The people I lost, the choices I made, they never leave. But that's what makes you who you are. You don't forget, you don't run from it. You just carry it and keep moving forward. The young lieutenant stared at him, his respect for Maverick growing deeper with every word. He had heard the stories, read the reports, but hearing it from Maverick himself was something else entirely. I think I get it now, the lieutenant said softly. You don't have to wear the title of hero. You just live it. Maverick nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Exactly. The title doesn't matter. It's what you do with your life that counts. Just as they were finishing their coffee, the door to the diner opened with a jingle, and a group of soldiers entered, laughing and talking among themselves. They took a quick glance around the diner, but their eyes quickly fell on Maverick. The laughter died down as they recognized him. One by one, they walked over to his table, stopping in front of him with a respectful silence. Maverick didn't say a word. He simply looked up at them, his face unreadable. Finally, one of the soldiers spoke. Sir, he said quietly, we just wanted to thank you for everything you did for us. You were the reason we made it out. We never forgot you. Maverick nodded, his gaze steady. You don't need to thank me, he said, his voice calm. You made it out because you were good at what you do. I was just there to help when you needed it. The soldiers stood there for a moment, silent in the presence of a man they had admired from afar. Finally, they saluted him, one by one, before walking out of the diner. The young lieutenant, who had been watching the entire exchange, felt a lump form in his throat. You don't need to say anything, do you? He asked quietly. Maverick shook his head. Some things don't need to be said. The respect is already there. The young man's admiration for Maverick deepened as he watched the old man sit back in his booth, the weight of his past and his legacy resting lightly on his shoulders. Maverick had lived a life filled with danger, loss, and sacrifice. But in the end, it wasn't the battles he fought or the medals he earned that defined him. It was the quiet respect of those who had witnessed his actions and understood the man he truly was. And as the young lieutenant sat across from him, he realized that he, too, would carry that lesson with him for the rest of his life. The evening sky had begun to darken as Maverick and the young lieutenant stepped out of the diner. The lights of the city flickered in the distance, casting long shadows on the quiet streets. Maverick adjusted his jacket and took a deep breath, the cool air filling his lungs as he looked around, almost as if taking in the quiet of the moment. You know, this place used to be full of life, Maverick said, his voice soft, as if he were speaking to himself. Back when I first started flying, we'd come here after missions. It was the only place that felt real. No reporters, no cameras, just us, talking about the things no one else would understand. The young lieutenant walked beside him, his hands in his pockets, still processing the lessons Maverick had shared. I can't imagine what it was like, he said, his voice reflective. I've heard the stories, but it's different when you meet someone who lived through it. You just don't know what to say after that. Maverick glanced at him with a half-smile. It's not about what you say, son. It's about what you do. People remember actions, not words. The rest fades. As they reached the street corner, Maverick paused. The sound of approaching footsteps caught their attention. The young lieutenant looked around, spotting a group of military personnel walking down the sidewalk. They wore dark green uniforms, their expressions serious. Maverick didn't seem to notice them at first. He was lost in thought, his gaze fixed on the street ahead. But then, one of the soldiers, a man in his late 30s with a square jaw and a sharp gaze, approached them. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his voice respectful but firm. Maverick turned slowly, meeting the man's eyes without missing a beat. "What can I do for you, soldier?" The soldier hesitated, his eyes flicking briefly to the lieutenant before settling back on Maverick. "Sir, I don't know if you remember me, but I was one of the pilots in that mission. The one over in the eastern desert, in '88. Maverick's eyes narrowed slightly, but his face remained impassive. "I remember," he said quietly. The soldier shifted on his feet, clearly uncomfortable. "We never had a chance to thank you for what you did. You saved us. All of us. And I wanted to say thank you." There was a brief silence, and then the soldier snapped to attention, his face serious. Maverick stood there for a moment, his expression unreadable, before he gave a small nod. "You're welcome," he said simply. The soldier, still standing at attention, looked at him with a mix of reverence and gratitude. "We all remember. We don't forget what you did." Maverick's eyes softened slightly, but his words were still steady. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "You did what needed to be done. I was just there to make sure you made it back." The soldier nodded, and for a moment, there was a mutual understanding between them, an unspoken bond forged in the heat of battle. Then, without another word, the soldier turned and walked away, rejoining his comrades. The young lieutenant, who had been silent through the exchange, watched them go. "You don't talk about it, do you?" he asked softly, his gaze still on the soldiers. Maverick didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a deep breath and glanced at the sky, as if trying to find the right words. "No," he said finally. "Some things are just too heavy to speak about. You carry them with you, but you don't talk about them. Not unless you have to." The young lieutenant nodded, his respect for Maverick growing with each passing moment. "I don't know if I could ever do what you did," he said, his voice sincere. "I don't think I'm built for that kind of life." Maverick looked at him, his expression thoughtful. "You never know what you're built for until you're tested. It's easy to say what you're capable of when you're sitting on the sidelines. But when it's your turn, when you're in the thick of it, you'll surprise yourself." The young lieutenant looked at him, a question lingering in his eyes. "What if I'm not ready? What if I'm not strong enough?" Maverick smiled, his eyes showing a rare softness. "None of us are born ready, son. Strength comes from experience, from the choices you make when you have nothing left to give. You'll find it when you need it most. I have no doubt you'll find yours." As they continued to walk down the street, Maverick's words echoed in the lieutenant's mind. For the first time, he truly understood what it meant to be a hero. It wasn't about medals or titles. It wasn't about being remembered by the world. It was about doing what needed to be done, even when it was hard, even when it seemed impossible. It was about carrying the weight of the past with dignity and grace, and moving forward. And as they reached the edge of the city, where the quiet suburbs met the open fields, Maverick turned to the lieutenant one last time. "You'll be all right," he said. "Just remember what I told you." The young lieutenant nodded, his heart swelling with a newfound sense of purpose. As Maverick walked off into the night, the lieutenant stood there for a moment, watching him go. He would never forget this day, the lessons learned, and the man who had shown him what it truly meant to serve, to sacrifice, and to live with honor. The following morning, the young lieutenant woke up early, the weight of Maverick's words still heavy in his chest. He had spent the night turning over everything he had learned, trying to understand the deeper meaning behind the old man's calm demeanor, his humility despite the legend that surrounded him. The city outside the window was waking up, its streets bustling with life as the sun rose over the horizon. The lieutenant stood up from the bed, his mind focused and sharp, determined to put everything Maverick had said into action. He dressed in his uniform, the fabric crisp against his skin, and stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his cap. Today was going to be different. As he walked out of the hotel and toward the military base, the world seemed quieter somehow, more meaningful. The respect he had for Maverick had now solidified into something deeper, something more personal. Maverick wasn't just a war hero or a legend. He was a reminder of what it meant to be truly honorable, to live a life defined not by the recognition you received, but by the way you treated others and the actions you took when no one was watching. The lieutenant arrived at the base, his footsteps heavy with purpose. He walked through the security checkpoint, his eyes focused straight ahead. The guards nodded to him as he passed, but he barely noticed. He had a mission now, a new sense of duty that went beyond his rank or his assignments. Inside the base, the officers were already gathered in the briefing room. The lieutenant entered, standing tall at attention as he saluted his commanding officer. "Lieutenant," the colonel greeted him, his voice gruff but warm. "You're just in time. We have a new assignment. Gather around, everyone." The lieutenant took his place among the other soldiers, his heart beating faster. It was the first real test of his new understanding of what it meant to serve. The colonel outlined the mission. It was a reconnaissance operation in a dangerous, remote region where enemy forces had been reported. The mission was high risk, but the lieutenant felt an overwhelming sense of clarity. He knew what he had to do. As the briefing continued, the lieutenant's mind drifted back to Maverick's words. "It's not about what you say. It's about what you do." The room began to fill with a quiet energy, the soldiers around him focused on the task at hand. But for the lieutenant, it wasn't just about the mission anymore. It was about carrying the legacy of those who had gone before him, those who had lived and died for something greater than themselves. The colonel finished the briefing and dismissed the group, sending everyone to prepare for the mission. The lieutenant gathered his gear, his hands steady but his mind racing. As he walked out of the room, he encountered one of the soldiers who had been in the diner the night before, the one who had come to thank Maverick. The soldier gave him a nod, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they shared. The lieutenant returned the gesture, his respect for the man growing. They both knew what it meant to serve, what it meant to stand tall in the face of adversity, and what it meant to carry the weight of the past without ever showing it. Outside the base, the lieutenant climbed into the military transport vehicle that would take them to their destination. As they drove through the familiar landscape, the young man felt something shift inside him. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He wasn't just following orders. He was carrying the legacy of every veteran who had ever worn the uniform, from the ones who had come before him to the ones who would follow in his footsteps. The mission was dangerous, but the lieutenant felt ready. He had found his purpose. It wasn't about being recognized. It wasn't about the accolades or the medals. It was about living up to the example set by those who had come before him, about doing his duty without question or hesitation. The convoy rolled toward the edge of the base, where the mission would begin. The lieutenant looked out at the horizon, the mountains looming in the distance. This was his moment. He was ready to face whatever came next, not because he was confident in his own strength, but because he had learned what it truly meant to be a man of honor. As the convoy turned onto the rugged path that led to their destination, the lieutenant felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had found the strength Maverick had spoken of. It wasn't in the physical prowess or the bravado. It was in the quiet resolve to do what was right, to serve with integrity, and to never forget the sacrifices made along the way. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but for the first time, the lieutenant was sure of his place in it. He was ready, and no matter the outcome of the mission, he knew that the true measure of a man wasn't in his rank or his past, but in the actions he took to honor those who had gone before him. The convoy rumbled through the rocky terrain, the hum of the engines and the crunch of gravel beneath the tires filling the air. The lieutenant sat in the back of the vehicle, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his mind focused on the task at hand. He could feel the weight of the mission bearing down on him, but it wasn't the pressure of the assignment itself that weighed most heavily on his shoulders. It was the sense of responsibility, the realization that he wasn't just following orders anymore. He was part of something much bigger than himself. As the convoy made its way deeper into the wilderness, the lieutenant thought back to the conversation he had with Maverick just days earlier. The old man's words echoed in his mind, reminding him that honor wasn't earned through accolades or recognition. It was earned through the choices you made when it mattered most. The terrain grew more rugged, the landscape shifting from dry, barren earth to dense, rocky hills. The lead vehicle slowed, signaling that they were approaching the target area. The lieutenant's heart raced as the convoy came to a halt. He could feel the adrenaline building in his chest, his muscles tensing as he prepared for what lay ahead. The soldiers in the convoy began to move quickly, unloading their gear and checking their weapons. The lieutenant followed their lead, his hands steady as he checked his rifle and adjusted his gear. The team was well trained, and there was no room for hesitation. Every move had to be calculated. Every decision had to be precise. As they made their way to the designated staging area, the lieutenant's thoughts drifted back to Maverick. He had spent so much of his career focusing on the outward appearance of leadership, rank, recognition, and power. But Maverick had shown him a different way, a more subtle form of leadership. It wasn't about the title you held or the medals you wore. It was about what you did in the quiet moments when no one was watching. It was about integrity, honor, and the strength to keep going even when the world seemed to turn against you. The lieutenant could feel that strength growing within him, slowly but surely. As they approached the edge of the enemy's territory, the team leader gave the signal to move in. The soldiers moved swiftly, their training taking over as they maneuvered through the rocky terrain, their eyes scanning for any signs of movement. The lieutenant's heart beat faster as the anticipation built. They were about to enter the danger zone. As they advanced, the team leader gave a hand signal to halt. The lieutenant crouched low, his eyes darting around as he waited for the next order. Time seemed to stretch, each second feeling like an eternity. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A shadow flitted across the rocks ahead. His hand instinctively gripped the rifle, his breath held tight in his chest. The team leader gave another signal, and the soldiers moved in, clearing the area with precision. The lieutenant followed, his senses on high alert, every muscle in his body ready to react at a moment's notice. The minutes dragged on, each one filled with tension and uncertainty. The team moved deeper into enemy territory, knowing that every step could be their last. The lieutenant could feel his heart pounding, but he kept moving, just as Maverick had taught him, steadfast, focused, and ready. Then, without warning, the sound of gunfire erupted from the rocks ahead. The lieutenant's instincts kicked in. He dropped to the ground, using the cover of the rocks to shield himself as the team returned fire. The noise was deafening, the crack of gunshots and the roar of explosions filling the air. The lieutenant's mind was sharp, his focus laser-like as he assessed the situation. He could hear the commands being shouted by the team leader, the orders given with the kind of confidence that could only come from years of experience. But it was in that moment, amid the chaos and the noise, that the lieutenant realized something. This was it. This was what it meant to be a soldier, to be part of something bigger than yourself. It wasn't about the glory or the recognition. It was about this quiet, dangerous work that kept the world safe, that kept the peace. The firefight raged on, the team moving in perfect synchronization, covering each other as they pushed forward. The lieutenant's heart still raced, but now it was different. He wasn't just following orders anymore. He was a part of something that was bigger than any one of them. The mission, the sacrifice, the honor, it was all connected. As the gunfire finally died down and the team regrouped, the lieutenant felt a sense of clarity settle over him. They had done it. They had completed the mission. But more than that, he had realized what Maverick had meant. This was the true meaning of honor, not in medals or recognition, but in the quiet strength to keep moving forward, no matter what. As the team made their way back to base, the lieutenant couldn't help but feel a sense of pride welling up inside him. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He had become a part of something much bigger than himself, and he knew, without a doubt, that he would carry that sense of duty with him for the rest of his life. The mission was over. The convoy had returned to base, the soldiers now walking with a quiet confidence, knowing they had completed what they had set out to do. The young lieutenant, still processing everything he had learned over the past few days, walked alongside the others, his thoughts heavy with the weight of the experience. He had seen the true meaning of honor and duty on that mission, felt the rawness of the danger they had faced, and he knew that the lessons Maverick had taught him were not just words. They were the foundation of everything he would do moving forward. As they arrived back at the base, the lieutenant made his way to the debriefing room. The commanding officer was waiting for them, his stern face softening slightly as he saw the team return unscathed. "You did good out there," the colonel said, his voice low and measured. The lieutenant nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. It wasn't just about doing good. It was about doing what was necessary, what was right, no matter the cost. Inside the debriefing room, the team gathered around the table, the silence between them speaking volumes. The lieutenant took his seat, his hands folded neatly in front of him as the colonel began to speak. This mission was a success, but we all know that success isn't just measured by results. It's about how we handle what comes after. We've seen how close we came to losing everything. But today, you proved that you have what it takes to get the job done. Well done, everyone. The room fell quiet as the lieutenant reflected on those words. It wasn't just about the mission. It was about the bond they had forged, the trust they had built in. The heat of battle. The lieutenant glanced around the room, meeting the eyes of his fellow soldiers. They were more than just teammates now, they were a family. The debriefing continued, but the lieutenant's mind wandered back to Maverick. The lessons he had learned from the old man were becoming clearer by the moment. It wasn't about the medals. It wasn't about the glory. It was about the quiet strength to do what was right, to honor those who had come before, and to never forget the sacrifices made along the way. Later that evening, after the debriefing had ended, the lieutenant found himself alone in his barracks room, sitting in front of a small desk with a cup of coffee in hand. The air was still, the weight of the day settling in as he let his thoughts drift. He thought about the mission, the soldiers he had worked alongside, and the lessons Maverick had shared with him. There was a deep sense of peace within him now, a calm that came from knowing that he had done his part. The door to his room opened, and one of his fellow soldiers entered, a friendly grin on his face. "Hey, you heading to the mess hall? You could use a meal after today." The lieutenant smiled faintly, setting his coffee down. "Yeah, I could use something to eat." As they walked through the base, the lieutenant couldn't help but notice the small, everyday moments that made this place feel like home. The chatter of fellow soldiers, the sound of boots on gravel, the quiet hum of the base at night. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The lieutenant had come to understand that it wasn't the grand gestures that defined a man. It was the everyday actions, the quiet moments of integrity, and the respect you earned by living a life of purpose. As they sat down at the mess hall, the lieutenant found himself lost in thought again. But this time it wasn't about the mission or the weight of the past. It was about the future. He was no longer just a soldier following orders. He had become something more. Maverick had shown him that it wasn't about the recognition. It was about how you lived, how you honored those who had come before, and how you carried that legacy forward. The lieutenant knew he was ready for whatever came next. Whatever the future held, he would face it with the same quiet strength, the same unwavering resolve. He would be the kind of man Maverick had shown him to be. A man of honor. A man who did what was right, not because he had to, but because it was the only way to live. And as the evening wore on, with the sound of soldiers talking and eating around him, the lieutenant felt a sense of belonging he had never known before. He wasn't just part of a unit. He was part of something much bigger, something that went beyond the mission, beyond the battlefield. He was part of a legacy that would live on long after he was gone. The days following the mission were a blur for the lieutenant. He threw himself into his work with a renewed sense of purpose, but there was something different about the way he approached each task. Gone were the days when he focused solely on the technical aspects of being a soldier. Now, he was focused on the bigger picture, on the mission as a whole. Every decision he made was influenced by the lessons he had learned from Maverick, the man who had shown him what true honor and duty meant. He had become more than just a soldier. He had become a part of a legacy. One afternoon, a few weeks after the mission, the lieutenant found himself sitting in the base's mess hall, eating a quiet lunch. The usual chatter of the soldiers filled the air, but his mind was elsewhere. He had heard rumors that Maverick had left the area. He hadn't seen the old man since the mission, and part of him felt a sense of loss, as though something important had been taken away. As he finished his meal, the door to the mess hall swung open, and in walked a familiar face. The young lieutenant's heart skipped a beat as he stood up, his eyes widening. It was Maverick. The old man had returned. He was dressed casually, his cap pulled low over his eyes, and he looked as calm and composed as ever. He scanned the room briefly before his gaze settled on the lieutenant. Without a word, Maverick walked over to his table, his footsteps deliberate. The lieutenant stood, unsure of what to say. Maverick smiled faintly and sat down across from him. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice low but friendly. The lieutenant didn't hesitate. "Of course, sir." They sat in silence for a moment, the noise of the mess hall fading into the background as Maverick took a sip from his cup. "I heard you've been busy," Maverick said, breaking the silence. "The mission went well, I trust." The lieutenant nodded, his expression serious. Yes, sir. We did what we were supposed to. But more than that, I learned a lot. I realized it's not just about doing your job. It's about living up to the example of those who came before you. Maverick's eyes flickered with recognition. You've got it now, he said, a hint of pride in his voice. You understand what it means to be more than just a soldier. The lieutenant felt a sense of relief wash over him. Maverick's words confirmed everything he had been feeling. He wasn't just following orders anymore. He was living with a sense of purpose, with a deeper understanding of what it meant to serve. I couldn't have done it without you, the lieutenant said, his voice quiet. Maverick waved off the compliment. You had it in you all along. I just helped you see it. They sat in silence for a while longer, the weight of their shared experiences hanging between them. The young lieutenant didn't feel the need to speak. He had already said what needed to be said, and Maverick, the man who had lived through so much, didn't need words to understand. Finally, Maverick stood up, preparing to leave. I'm not here for long, he said, his gaze steady. But I wanted to check in, see how you were doing. The lieutenant stood with him, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. Thank you, sir, for everything. Maverick nodded, his expression softening. You're ready now? Remember what I told you. It's not about the medals or the rank. It's about the people you serve, the lives you touch, and the legacy you leave behind. Keep that in mind, and you'll do just fine. With that, Maverick turned and walked toward the door, disappearing into the crowd of soldiers who had gathered in the mess hall. The lieutenant stood there, watching him go, his heart full of respect and admiration. As Maverick faded from view, the lieutenant knew that the lessons he had learned would stay with him for the rest of his life. He had become part of something bigger than himself, something that could never be taken away. The legacy of honor, duty, and sacrifice would live on in him, just as it had lived on in Maverick. And for the first time, the lieutenant felt truly ready for whatever came next. The days that followed Maverick's visit to the mess hall felt strangely quieter to the lieutenant. There was a calm that settled over him, not just from the mission's success, but from the certainty that he was now walking a path he truly understood. The weight of the lessons learned from Maverick was still heavy on his heart, but it was a weight he welcomed, because it gave him direction. Every moment now seemed more meaningful, as though he could see the world through a new lens. He noticed the little things, the quiet respect soldiers showed one another, the dedication that ran through every action, no matter how small. One afternoon, as the sun began to set over the base, the lieutenant was sitting in his office, going over some reports when his thoughts drifted back to Maverick's words. It's not about the medals or the rank. It's about the people you serve, the lives you touch, and the legacy you leave behind. Those words echoed in his mind, and for the first time, the lieutenant felt a deep, unshakable conviction. It wasn't the awards he would one day receive that would define him. It was how he treated others, how he led, and how he carried himself through both the quiet moments and the chaos. As he sat there, lost in thought, the door to his office opened, and one of his fellow officers walked in. Lieutenant, the officer said, his tone respectful, the colonel's looking for you. The lieutenant nodded, rising from his chair. The colonel's office was just down the hall, and as he walked there, he couldn't shake the feeling that something important was about to happen. He knocked lightly on the door and entered. The colonel, a tall man with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, looked up from his desk. Lieutenant, come in. We have a situation, the colonel said. A situation, sir? The lieutenant asked, his senses alert. The colonel's face was serious. We've just received intelligence about an enemy unit advancing towards a nearby village. They're heavily armed and moving quickly. We've been tasked with stopping them before they reach civilian territory. The lieutenant's heart quickened, but he remained steady. This was what he had trained for. This was the moment he had been preparing for his entire career. What's the plan, sir? The colonel stood up and walked to the map on the wall. We'll be moving out at first light. I want you to lead a small team to set up an observation point along their likely route. The rest of the team will be positioned further along the route for interception. The lieutenant nodded. He was ready. This was what he had been waiting for. As the briefing concluded and the lieutenant left the colonel's office, he couldn't help but feel the familiar surge of adrenaline. The mission was on, and it was time to put everything he had learned into action. As he gathered his gear, he felt the weight of his responsibility. He wasn't just leading men and women into battle. He was upholding a legacy, one built on honor, respect, and selfless service. The hours before dawn were always the hardest. As the lieutenant and his team made their way to the observation point, the stillness of the night seemed to stretch endlessly, as if time itself were holding its breath. They moved quietly, the only sound the crunch of gravel underfoot and the occasional rustling of gear. The terrain was rough, the hills steep, but the lieutenant's focus never wavered. He had seen worse conditions in his time, and this felt like just another day on the job. Once they reached their designated position, the team settled in, setting up surveillance equipment and positioning themselves for maximum visibility. The lieutenant scanned the horizon, his mind racing with possible outcomes. He had always prided himself on being prepared for anything, but there was something different about this mission. It wasn't just the usual stakes of completing an assignment. It was about the lives that were at risk, civilians caught in the crossfire, soldiers who might never come home. And in that moment, it became clear to him what Maverick had been teaching him all along. It wasn't about winning battles. It wasn't about glory or recognition. It was about doing what was right, no matter the cost. As the sun began to rise, casting long shadows over the land, the lieutenant's eyes narrowed. Through the scope, he saw movement in the distance. The enemy was approaching. The time to act was now. The team leader gave the signal, and the lieutenant's voice was calm as he relayed the orders. "Prepare for interception," he said, his voice steady despite the tension. The team moved quickly and silently into position. Every muscle in the lieutenant's body was on high alert as he took his place, his mind focused entirely on the task at hand. The enemy was getting closer. There would be no room for mistakes. The next few minutes felt like hours. The lieutenant could hear the distant sound of engines, the soft rumble of vehicles moving across the land. They were closing in. The lieutenant's heart raced, but his mind remained sharp. He had done this 1,000 times in training. Now it was time to put that training to use. And then, as the enemy convoy neared, the first shots were fired. The battle had begun. The lieutenant's orders were clear, and his team moved with precision, covering each other as they engaged the enemy. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. It was just the quiet confidence of soldiers doing what they had been trained to do. As the mission continued, the lieutenant felt that same sense of peace he had felt in the mess hall with Maverick. It wasn't about the accolades or recognition. It was about getting the job done and making sure everyone made it home. By the time the operation was over, the enemy had been neutralized, and the village was safe. The lieutenant stood in the aftermath, surveying the scene with a quiet sense of pride. They had done it. They had protected the innocent. And for the first time, the lieutenant understood that this was what it meant to be part of something bigger. It wasn't about the glory. It was about the lives you saved, the people you protected, and the legacy you left behind. The aftermath of the mission left the base quieter than usual. The young lieutenant sat in his office, the soft hum of the base filtering through the walls. He stared at the reports on his desk, the numbers and details seeming insignificant in comparison to the real reason they had all been there, to protect, to serve, and to honor the legacy of those who had paved the way. The last few weeks had changed him. Every mission, every encounter with his comrades, had reinforced the lessons Maverick had imparted. It wasn't just about combat or strategy. It was about who you were when no one was watching, about making the right decisions even when they weren't the easiest. The lieutenant's thoughts wandered back to the moment when Maverick had spoken those words to him. It's not about the medals or the rank. It's about the people you serve, the lives you touch, and the legacy you leave behind. It was clear now that the path forward wouldn't always be easy, but the principles Maverick had instilled in him would guide him through whatever came next. As he sat in his office, the door to his room opened quietly, and the colonel stepped inside, his face serious as always. "Lieutenant," the colonel said, "I need a word." The lieutenant immediately stood and saluted, his posture straight. "Yes, sir." The colonel looked at him with a steady gaze, as though appraising something. "I've been watching your progress, and I'm impressed. You've come a long way since that first mission. But there's something more I need to talk to you about." The lieutenant remained silent, waiting for the colonel to continue. "We have another operation coming up. It's a high-stakes one. We're going to need our best people in charge, and frankly, I think you're ready." The lieutenant's heart skipped a beat. The weight of the responsibility was beginning to sink in. This was no longer just about following orders. It was about leading others. "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down." The colonel gave a nod, his expression softening for a moment. "I know you won't. You've already proven you can handle the pressure. But remember, it's not just about leading during the mission. It's about leading after. You set the tone for the team, for everyone around you." The lieutenant nodded, feeling the gravity of the moment. He had been tested in ways he never expected, and now he was being given an opportunity to lead. The colonel turned to leave, but stopped, his hand on the doorframe. "One more thing," he added. "Maverick would be proud of you. You've taken his lessons to heart. That kind of leadership doesn't come easily, but you've earned it." The lieutenant felt a warmth in his chest at the mention of Maverick. The old man had taught him more than he could ever express. It was not about being remembered or recognized. It was about doing the right thing, time and time again, even when no one was watching. As the days passed and the operation loomed closer, the lieutenant couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the cusp of something important. His team, though composed of skilled and capable soldiers, had looked to him for guidance in the past, but now, he knew, it would be different. He wasn't just a member of the team. He was the one they would look to for direction. The morning of the mission arrived, and the base was alive with activity. Soldiers gathered in the briefing room, their gear packed and ready. The lieutenant stood at the front, his uniform pressed, his eyes steady. As the team gathered around, he could feel their anticipation. They knew what was at stake. The lieutenant took a deep breath and began. "Listen up, everyone. We've got a job to do. This mission is critical, but it's more than just about success. It's about protecting those who can't protect themselves. It's about ensuring that we all come home." He paused, scanning the faces of the soldiers in front of him. "We've trained for moments like this, and now is our time. We're not just fighting for victory, we're fighting for each other. So let's do this right. For everyone we serve, and for the legacy we're building." There was a moment of silence before one of the soldiers spoke up. "Let's get it done, Lieutenant." The lieutenant gave a nod, his heart swelling with pride. The respect he had earned from his team was something he would never take for granted. They weren't just following orders anymore. They were following him. As they moved out, the lieutenant felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders, but it wasn't the kind of weight that crushed you. It was the kind of weight that gave you strength. The convoy moved out, the familiar hum of the engines filling the air. The mission had begun, but this time, the lieutenant knew, it would be different. He was leading them now, not just in action, but in spirit. They were all a part of something bigger than themselves, and he would carry that with him every step of the way. As the convoy moved into the heart of enemy territory, the lieutenant's mind remained sharp. He had prepared for this. He had lived through this. And now, with his team by his side, he was ready to lead them through whatever came next. The operation was a success. The convoy had completed its mission, the enemy forces neutralized, and the village saved. As the lieutenant stood amidst the aftermath, surveying the quiet chaos of a job well done, he felt something shift within him. He had been tested, pushed to his limits, and had led his team with a confidence he had never known before. But the real victory wasn't in the success of the mission. It was in the way his team had followed him, the way they had trusted him to lead them. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the barren landscape, and the lieutenant stood there, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. As the team gathered their things and prepared to head back to base, one of the soldiers came over to him, a smile on his face. "You did good, Lieutenant," the soldier said, clapping him on the back. The lieutenant smiled, nodding. "We did good," he replied. The soldier's grin widened, and he gave the lieutenant a respectful salute. "Still, it's different when you're in charge. You kept us focused, kept us together. We're proud to follow you." The lieutenant felt a surge of pride. It wasn't about being in charge, about the title or the recognition. It was about earning the respect of his team, about showing them that he was worthy of their trust. And in that moment, he knew he had earned it. The convoy made its way back to base, the long drive a quiet reflection of what they had accomplished. As they entered the gates of the base, the lieutenant could see the familiar faces of the soldiers they had left behind. They had all been through the same training, the same hardships, but now, there was something different in the air. The lieutenant had earned his place, not just as a soldier, but as a leader. He stepped out of the vehicle, his boots crunching against the gravel as he walked toward the command center. The colonel was waiting for him, standing with a few other senior officers. As the lieutenant approached, the colonel gave him a sharp nod of approval. "Well done, Lieutenant," he said, his voice steady. You showed great leadership out there. The lieutenant saluted, his chest swelling with pride. Thank you, sir, he replied, his voice strong. The colonel turned to the other officers, gesturing toward the lieutenant. This is the kind of leadership we need. This is what we're building here. The officers nodded, their expressions serious but respectful. The lieutenant stood tall, his posture straight, as the weight of the colonel's words sank in. This wasn't just about doing the job. This was about building a legacy, about shaping the future of those who would follow. Later that evening, as the base settled into its usual rhythm, the lieutenant found himself walking alone down a quiet path near the barracks. The events of the day had settled into his mind, the adrenaline of the operation fading into the background. But there was a peace within him now, a peace that came from knowing he had done what was right, from knowing that his actions had made a difference. As he walked, he thought back to Maverick, to the lessons the old man had shared with him. Maverick had shown him what true honor and duty looked like, not in the grand gestures or the accolades, but in the quiet, everyday choices. The lieutenant had learned that leadership wasn't about commanding respect. It was about earning it, day by day, moment by moment. He paused, looking up at the sky as the first stars began to appear. It was a clear night, and the calmness of the scene felt like the perfect reflection of everything he had come to understand. The future was uncertain, and there would be more challenges ahead. But he was ready. He had found his purpose, and he knew that he would carry the lessons he had learned with him for the rest of his life. As the night stretched on, the lieutenant made his way back to his barracks, his heart light, his mind at peace. He had earned his place, and now, more than ever, he understood what it meant to be part of something bigger than himself. He had done it not for the recognition, not for the glory, but for the people he served, for the lives he had protected, and for the legacy he would leave behind.